There is something that almost nobody talks about when they tell the story of Michael Jordan. Not the championships, not the scoring titles, not the commercials or the sneakers or the cultural empire that bears his name. What almost nobody talks about is the 3-year period, 3 full years, when a team from Detroit built an entire philosophy of violence around one man and made it work. Made it work well enough to end Chicago's season 3 times in a row. Made it work well enough to make the greatest basketball player alive question whether he would ever hold a championship trophy. And the most extraordinary part of that story is not what the Detroit Pistons did to Michael Jordan. It is what Michael Jordan did with it afterward. But before we get to that, before we get to what happened in the locker rooms, on the practice floors, in the silent hours when Jordan was alone with his fury and his doubt, there is something you need to understand about how the Jordan rules were actually born. Because the story you think you know is incomplete. There was a conversation that happened before any of it became official. A conversation in a film room with a whiteboard, where a coach looked at his staff and said something that no one had ever said quite so systematically before. That conversation changed the course of basketball history, and it started, as these things often do, not with respect, but with fear. Chuck Daly was not an impulsive man. He had spent too many years in the game, absorbed too many lessons from too many defeats, to make decisions based on emotion. When he arrived in Detroit as head coach of the Pistons in 1983, he inherited a team with talent and without discipline. A team capable of winning on certain nights and collapsing completely on others. His first task was to install a culture. His second task, which arrived more urgently than he had anticipated, was to figure out what to do about Michael Jordan. Because by the middle of the 1986 season, it was already clear to anyone paying attention that Jordan was not a normal problem. He was not the kind of player you assigned a capable defender to and hoped for the best. He was something categorically different, a player whose combination of athleticism, intelligence, competitiveness, and sheer relentless will had no precedent in the game. You could not simply stop him. You had to change the fundamental approach to what stopping meant. Daly watched film for hours. He talked to his assistants. He talked to his players. And what emerged from those conversations was a document, an actual written document, that the Pistons players were given and expected to study. The Jordan Rules, a set of guidelines so specific, so comprehensive, so cold-blooded in their calculation that reading them now feels less like a basketball strategy and more like a manifesto. The question is, why did it take 3 years to beat them? The answer is one of the most revealing things you will ever learn about what Michael Jordan was made of. The rules themselves were both simple and brutal. The philosophy was this: every time Jordan touched the ball in a scoring position, the response was immediate and physical. 2 defenders collapsed on him always. If he drove left, his stronger side, he was met with contact at the shoulder and chest before he could generate momentum. If he drove right, he was allowed to proceed slightly further, then met with even harder contact at the moment of release, because the goal was to make him uncomfortable in the air, to disrupt the extraordinary body control that made him nearly unguardable by conventional means. If he pulled up for a mid-range jumper, a hand was in his face before he could set his feet. If he posted up on the block, Bill Laimbeer was behind him and Dennis Rodman beside him, and the message was delivered through elbows and hips and shoulders: you are not going to get a clean look. You are not going to get anything clean. Everything will cost you something. Laimbeer was the enforcer by reputation, but the architects were Rodman and Joe Dumars. Dumars, whose personal integrity and sportsmanship made him the most unexpected instrument of the plan, and Rodman, whose physical gifts and psychological unpredictability made him something close to a perfect defensive weapon. They practiced this. They drilled it in training sessions where scouts and reporters were not allowed. It was not improvised. It was designed, rehearsed, and executed with the precision of something that had been studied and engineered rather than intuited. And in 1988, the first year the plan was deployed in full playoff intensity, it worked. The Detroit Pistons met the Chicago Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals, and what the country witnessed was not basketball in any conventional sense. It was more elemental than that. It was closer to something you might find in a nature documentary, the systematic neutralization of a predator by a pack that had studied its patterns. Jordan averaged 36 points per game in that series, 36 points. And the Bulls still lost. They lost because scoring 36 points while absorbing that kind of physical punishment across the length of a playoff series extracts something from a body that does not fully return between games. Jordan would arrive at the arena the next day with bruises on his arms, soreness in his hips, stiffness in joints that should have been fluid. And still, he came back. And still, Detroit found ways to make it hurt. Game 4 of that series contained a sequence that Pistons players talked about for years afterward. Jordan drove the lane, absorbed contact from Laimbeer on the left side, and then Mayhorn on the right side simultaneously, somehow finished at the rim and landed hard on the baseline. He got up. He did not say a word. He walked back up the court. And the Pistons players looked at each other with the specific expression of people who have done everything right and still cannot quite believe what they are seeing. I remember thinking, Rodman would say years later, that this guy is not normal. We hit him with everything we had and he kept coming. But they won the series. And that was what mattered. For now. The off-season of 1988 was a strange one for Michael Jordan. From the outside, he had nothing to be dissatisfied about. He had just won his second consecutive scoring title. He had been named Defensive Player of the Year, an almost unheard-of distinction for a player who also led the league in scoring, proof of an athleticism and dedication that defied the usual trade-offs. He had made the All-Star game again as a starter, and this time there was no freeze-out. The veterans who had tried that trick in 1985 had watched what happened in the seasons that followed, and understood it was not a game they wanted to play twice. By any external measure, Michael Jordan was the best player in basketball, but he had lost again. And losing to Detroit, losing to a team that had built an entire defensive philosophy around stopping him, that had reduced the greatest scorer alive to a player who still scored 36 points and still lost, that sat in him in a way that other losses did not. This was not the ordinary pain of a team that was outplayed. This was something more targeted, more personal. Detroit had looked at Michael Jordan, studied him, and decided that the path to beating him was to make being him cost too much. They were right, and that was the part that burned the hardest. What happened in the Chicago Bulls training facility during the summer and fall of 1988 was not dramatic in the visible sense. There were no speeches, no declarations, no public statements about what was coming. There was only work. But the nature of the work was changing. Phil Jackson had not yet arrived. That transformation was still a year away. But Jordan was already beginning to understand something that his coaches and teammates and the critics who covered him were all trying to tell him in their various ways. He understood it not because he agreed with them, but because he was losing, and he hated losing more than he hated anything else in the world. The team around him was not good enough. Not yet. Scottie Pippen was developing but still inconsistent. Horace Grant was improving, but the overall roster had gaps that a single player's brilliance could not fill. Jordan needed teammates who could be trusted when he was being double-teamed, who could accept the ball when two defenders collapsed on him and make Detroit pay for the decision. That required a Jordan who was willing to pass into those situations rather than searching for the individual answer. And that, for Michael Jordan in 1988, was not yet fully available. He was not yet the Jordan who trusted the system. He was still, in crucial moments, the Jordan who believed that the only reliable solution lived at the end of his own arm. The 1989 playoffs brought Detroit and Chicago together again, this time in the Eastern Conference Finals, and this time the Pistons were even more prepared. They had refined the Jordan rules over an additional season of film study and physical implementation. They knew his tendencies more precisely, knew which shoulder he favored when driving into traffic, knew the specific game situations in which he was most likely to abandon the pass for the shot, knew how to position their help defense to maximize the deterrence effect. The series was violent and grinding and brilliant in the way that only basketball played at the edge of what is legal can be. Jordan averaged 32 points per game. The Bulls lost again in 6 games. The locker room afterward was the quietest place in Chicago. Players sat at their lockers and did not look at each other. Jordan dressed without speaking and left without the usual post-game availability for reporters. There was nothing to say that was not already obvious. 3 years of preparation, 3 years of improvement, and still Detroit was standing at the end of May, and Chicago was not. The Jordan rules were not just working, they were defining the ceiling of what Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls could achieve. Here is the part of the story that never makes it into the highlights. Here is the part that happened in private, that was not filmed or reported or witnessed by anyone outside the people in the room. After the 1989 loss to Detroit, Michael Jordan sat with his father. James Jordan, the man who had told his son after the championship shot at North Carolina that his life would never be the same, was not a man who offered empty reassurance. He was the kind of father who told his children difficult things with clarity and love in the same sentence. And in the days after the Detroit loss, James Jordan told his son something that Michael would carry for the rest of his life. He said, "You are trying to beat them by being better at what you already are. But they have already solved what you already are. You have to become something they haven't solved yet." It was not a basketball lecture. It was a father talking to a son about the nature of transformation, about the difference between working harder at the thing you know and working differently at the thing you have not yet attempted. Jordan heard it. He sat with it. He went back to Chicago and began to change. The arrival of Phil Jackson as head coach in the fall of 1989 is the moment that most basketball historians identify as the turning point. And they are not wrong. Jackson's implementation of the triangle offense, his psychological sophistication, his ability to manage Jordan's competitive intensity while channeling it toward collective goals rather than individual achievement, all of that was genuinely transformative. But what those accounts sometimes understate is what Jordan had already started becoming before Jackson walked through the door. The transformation that Jackson would complete had already begun in the silence of a locker room in Detroit, in a conversation with a father, in the private recognition that the Jordan rules had exposed not a limitation in Jordan's talent, but a limitation in Jordan's philosophy. He had been trying to beat Detroit by being Michael Jordan harder. Jackson helped him understand that what was needed was to be Michael Jordan differently. That distinction between more and different is one of the most important lessons in the entire story, and it is one that almost nobody talks about because the highlight reel version of the story starts with Jackson and ends with the championship, and everything in between is collapsed into a montage. But the montage is where the real work happened. Jackson introduced the triangle offense to a locker room that received it with something between skepticism and hostility. The triangle was a system built on player movement, ball movement, and decision-making at multiple positions rather than concentrating creation in the hands of one dominant playmaker. For a team that had been organized around Michael Jordan's individual brilliance, it was a philosophical revolution, and Jordan's initial response was not graceful. He pushed back in practice. He voiced his doubts to assistants. He had a meeting with Jackson in which he made his position clear. He had led the league in scoring for 3 consecutive years. He was the best individual player in basketball, and he was being asked to accept a system that would reduce his shot attempts and trust teammates whose reliability he had genuine experience-based reasons to question. Jackson listened to all of this without flinching. Then he said something that Jordan would later describe as the most important thing anyone said to him in his professional career. Jackson said, "Michael, I believe you are capable of being the best player in the history of this game, but you cannot get there alone. The only path through Detroit is through your teammates. I am asking you to trust them enough to find out whether I am right." Jordan looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You'd better be right." The 1990 Eastern Conference Finals, Detroit and Chicago for the 3rd consecutive year, was a different series than the 2 that had preceded it, not because the Jordan rules had been abandoned. They had not. Daly and his staff ran the same physical, systematic scheme they had perfected over the previous 2 years. But the Bulls had changed in ways that made the scheme less effective. When Detroit collapsed 2 defenders onto Jordan on the wing, Jordan found Pippen cutting to the basket and delivered the pass. When Laimbeer positioned himself to make the drive cost maximum pain, Jordan set screens for Grant in the post and created mismatches from a distance. The triangle was working. Not perfectly, Not yet with the fluid inevitability it would achieve in the championship years, but well enough to create new problems for a Detroit team that had prepared for the old ones. Detroit still won the series, 4-3, with the decisive Game 7 played in a Detroit that was roaring with the specific confidence of a champion defending territory. The Bulls lost. But the loss felt different. For the first time in 3 years, the gap felt like something that could be closed rather than something structural. Jordan, who averaged 28 points per game in the series, down from previous years, evidence that the triangle was redistributing his shot attempts, shot 50% from the field, one of his most efficient playoff performances. He was trusting the system, and the system was working, just not quite enough. Not yet. Detroit celebrated in their locker room with the controlled satisfaction of professionals who had done their job. Daly told reporters that the Jordan rules were still the blueprint, that as long as his team executed them with the precision they had shown that season, Chicago had no answer. Isaiah Thomas, who had been both the architect and the enforcer of the team's psychological approach to Jordan, was more pointed in his assessment. "We know how to play him," Thomas said, with a confidence that sounded absolute. "We have always known how to play him. That is not changing." What Thomas could not see, what no one outside the Bulls' practice facility could see, was that Jordan was in the middle of a transformation that the Jordan rules had not accounted for. Not a physical transformation. The physical gifts were already complete, already at their ceiling. What was transforming was the interior landscape, the way Jordan understood his role, his responsibility to his teammates, his definition of winning. For the first 7 years of his professional career, winning had meant Jordan performing at his maximum and the team benefiting from that performance. The new understanding was something more complex and more powerful. Winning meant the team performing at its maximum, and Jordan was the engine of that performance, not because he took the most shots, but because his presence, his threat, his willingness to pass into the right situations at the right moments, created conditions in which everyone around him could be more than they were on their own. The summer of 1990 was the last summer the Jordan rules worked as designed. It was the last summer that Chuck Daly's blueprint functioned as the ceiling of Michael Jordan's ambition. And it was the last summer that the Detroit Pistons could honestly look at the calendar and believe that Chicago was a manageable problem rather than an inevitability. There is a training session from that fall, October 1990, the Bulls in their practice facility in Deerfield, Illinois, that has been described by multiple players who were present. It was an ordinary Tuesday practice, the kind of session that fills the long stretch of autumn before the regular season begins. Jackson ran the team through triangle sets, defensive rotations, the physical conditioning drills that every NBA team runs in that period. And then, toward the end of practice, Jordan gathered the team in a circle. Not called by the coaches, called by Jordan, who almost never did this, who communicated primarily through his play rather than his words. He stood in the middle of the circle and looked at each of his teammates in turn, the way a man looks at people he is about to commit to. He said, "This is the year." That was all. No speech, no elaboration. This is the year. The players around him understood that something had shifted. Pippen nodded. Grant nodded. The assistant coaches, standing at the edge of the court, exchanged a glance. Jackson, who had watched all of this from the sideline, said nothing. He didn't need to. He had bet everything on the possibility of this moment, and it had arrived. The 1991 Eastern Conference Finals was the series that broke the Detroit Pistons. Not physically. The bad boys remained the bad boys, physically imposing and psychologically relentless to the final buzzer. But strategically and spiritually, it was a demolition. The Bulls won the opening game and never lost the lead in the series. Chicago's execution of the triangle was different in a way that Daly and his staff had not anticipated. Not just better, but fundamentally different in its confidence. Jordan was playing within the system with genuine conviction rather than reluctant compliance. When double teams came, he passed before they arrived rather than after. When the spacing was right, he found cutters in the flow of the offense rather than as a fallback option after the drive was denied. He was anticipating the Jordan rules rather than reacting to them, which meant the rules were always arriving slightly too late. The Pistons made adjustments they called timeouts. They changed coverages. Nothing worked. Chicago won 4 consecutive games, and the final game was the most complete team basketball performance the Bulls had produced in the Jordan era. Daley sat on the Detroit bench in the 4th quarter of that game and watched something he had not allowed himself to imagine. The Jordan rules failing not because Detroit executed them poorly, but because Chicago had evolved past them. He had built the most sophisticated individual defensive system in the history of the game, and the player it was designed to stop had simply outgrown it. That is the nature of extraordinary people. You can build walls around them, but walls have heights, and some people will always eventually find a way over. The famous image from the end of that series, the one that circulated in newspapers and on television broadcasts across the country, was of the Detroit Pistons leaving the court in the final minutes of Game 4, while the game was still being played, without shaking hands, without the acknowledgement that had been a convention of the sport since its earliest years. Players filing off the bench, walking through the tunnel, Isaiah Thomas at the front of the line, his expression containing something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but resided in the space between them. The commentary at the time was divided. Some saw it as unsportsmanlike, a failure of the grace that competition is supposed to produce. Others saw it as a comprehensible response to the specific rawness of what Detroit had just experienced. Not just a series loss, but the collapse of a system that had defined them, the end of an era they had not consented to ending. What is most interesting in retrospect is what Michael Jordan did not do with that image. He did not use it publicly. He did not invoke it in interviews or press conferences as proof of something he needed to prove. He filed it away in the same furnace where he kept everything else, every cut, every freeze-out, every Jordan rule that had left bruises on his body and questions in his mind. The furnace ran on all of it, and now it was running hotter than ever. The 1991 NBA Finals, Chicago against the Los Angeles Lakers, Magic Johnson's last great team, was not really about the Lakers. Not in the way that championship series are supposed to be about the opponent. What the 1991 Finals was about, more than anything, was the completion of a journey that had begun in the Eastern Conference. Jordan averaged 31 points and 11 assists per game against Los Angeles, the assists number being the figure that silenced every critic who had spent 6 years arguing that he could not elevate his teammates, that he was a scorer, and nothing more. 11 assists per game in the NBA Finals from a player the Jordan rules had been designed to isolate and contain. The strategy had tried to prove that Jordan's teammates could not handle the ball. Jordan had responded by making his teammates better than anyone believed they could be. When the final buzzer sounded in Game 5, and the Bulls were champions for the first time, Jordan sat on the floor of the Chicago Stadium and wept. Not quietly, fully, openly, without any attempt at the composure that his competitive persona usually demanded. He held the trophy and cried because he had been carrying something for 3 years that needed to be set down, and now the floor was there, and the trophy was in his hands, and it was over. His father found him in the locker room. James Jordan put his arms around his son and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I knew you'd figure it out." Here is what the Jordan rules actually were in the end. Not just a defensive strategy, not just a set of physical instructions given to Bill Laimbeer and Dennis Rodman and Joe Dumars about where to put their bodies when number 23 caught the ball in the post. The Jordan rules were a test, a 3-year test of one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in human achievement. When the world builds a system specifically to stop you, when the most sophisticated opposition you have ever faced studies everything you are and designs a solution to contain it, what do? Do you accept the ceiling? Do you adapt around it? Do you become something the system was not built for? Michael Jordan's answer was given not in words, but in the accumulation of 3 years of invisible work, painful losses, forced evolution, and the kind of trust that only becomes possible after everything else has been tried and found insufficient. He became something the Jordan rules could not contain. Not because he was more athletic, not because he was stronger or faster or more talented in some raw physical sense, but because he changed his philosophy. He let his teammates in. He accepted that the most powerful version of himself was not the one that required no one else. It was the one that made everyone around him more than they would have been without him. That transformation from individual brilliance to collective greatness is what the Jordan rules actually produced. And it is precisely the opposite of what Chuck Daly intended. There is a question worth sitting with after you have absorbed all of this. Not about basketball, about the thing that basketball is a metaphor for, which is the structure of any serious attempt to do something extraordinary in the world. At some point, in almost every meaningful endeavor, the world will study you. It will look at how you operate, what you are good at, where you are vulnerable, and it will build something designed to stop you at those exact points. Your competition, your critics, your circumstances, the systems and structures and people who look at what you are attempting and decide, for whatever reason, that they would prefer you did not succeed. They will build their version of the Jordan rules. And the question the Jordan story poses, directly without gentleness, is this: what kind of material are you made of when the system arrives? Because there are only a few possible responses. You can be stopped by the system, which is what most people do because the system is often very good, and the pressure it applies is very real. You can fight the system on its own terms, which is what Jordan did in 1988 and 1989, and which produced 36 points per game and 2 consecutive losses, because fighting a system on its own terms rarely produces victory when the system was designed by someone who understands you. Or you can do what Jordan eventually did. You can evolve past the system's premises. You can become someone the system was not built for. You can make the rules obsolete by changing what you are. That third option is the hardest one. It requires something that talent alone cannot provide. It requires the willingness to examine what the system has exposed about you, not what it has done to you, but what it has revealed about the limits of your current approach, and to use that information as a blueprint for growth rather than a wound to nurse. Jordan did not enjoy losing to Detroit. He hated it with the intensity that he brought to everything, but he used it. He took 3 years of systematic defeat and extracted from them the precise lessons he needed about the gap between being a great player and being an unbeatable one. The Jordan rules told him where the ceiling was. He used that information to find out whether he could raise it. He could. This is the part of the story that belongs to you now. Not the championships, not the trophies, not the image of Jordan weeping on the Chicago Stadium floor with the trophy in his arms. The part that belongs to you is the 3 years before that image, the 3 years of losing to a system, of being studied and contained and beaten by people who had figured out the formula. And what Jordan did with those 3 years, in the dark, and the silence, and the film rooms, and the conversations with his father, and the long, slow process of becoming something new, that is the inheritance. Because wherever you are right now, whatever version of the Jordan rules has been built around your life, whatever system has been designed, consciously or not, to contain what you are capable of, there is a version of you that the system has not accounted for. There is a version of you that has not yet been reached, that has not yet been studied, that is still in the process of becoming something more and different than what you currently are. The question is whether you are willing to go through the losses that will reveal it, whether you are willing to sit in the equivalent of that Detroit locker room 3 consecutive times and feel the full weight of what has not yet worked, and use that weight as information rather than conclusion. Michael Jordan lost to the Jordan rules for 3 years. 3 years. And then he became the person the Jordan rules could not stop. He did it by trusting his teammates, changing his philosophy, accepting the limitations of what he had been in order to become what he needed to be. He did it, ultimately, by making fuel out of fire. The same fuel he had been making since a high school gymnasium in North Carolina, since a list on a wall where his name did not appear. The Jordan rules tried to write his name off a different kind of list. They failed. Because that is what happens when a system designed to stop you encounters someone who has decided that being stopped is not among the available options. If this story reached something in you, if you recognize something in Jordan's 3 years of systematic defeat that mirrors something in your own experience, then do not let that recognition go to waste. There is a comment section below this video, and it exists for exactly this purpose: to be filled with your own version of this story, the system that was built around you, the rules someone wrote to contain what you were capable of. What happened when you figured out how to evolve past them? Tell us. Because the Jordan story is extraordinary precisely because it is not only about Jordan, it is about what becomes possible when the thing designed to stop you becomes the thing that reveals who you truly are. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. This is the channel where these stories live, the real ones. The ones that go past the highlights and into the rooms where the decisions were made, where the whiteboards held the strategies that were supposed to be permanent and turned out to be only temporary. Subscribe because you believe that the most important thing about the greatest competitor who ever played the game is not what he won. It is what he learned from what he lost. Subscribe because somewhere in your life, someone has drawn up the rules to stop you. And you need to know, really know in the deepest and most useful sense of the word, that those rules are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of the next chapter. The chapter where you become someone the rules were not built for. Get back in the gym. That is always where it starts.